Hello, I'm Jack Barlow, and I'm a professor of politics here at Juniata College in Pennsylvania. I'm here to talk about responsibility and citizenship for Tavana e-Learning Institute for Iranian Civil Society. And I'm glad to be connected to the Iranian people as we reflect on this important topic. Thank you very much for joining me. So I'm here to talk generally about responsibility and citizenship. And the first question that comes up when we talk about that is this question: why is there in America no template for citizenship? Why do we not have any guidance, any direction from our founding fathers about this subject? Because it's an important subject. We have elaborate instructions from them on how the Constitution should work. That's what the Constitution is a set of instructions for working government. And yet we have no such thing for the citizens who inhabit the government and who make it work. And I think there are a couple of reasons why the founding fathers chose not to do that. One is they assumed that the states were going to be the primary locus of activity. That people would vote in their states, that people would know others within their states, and that their primary activity would be state activity, and that the states, if the states wanted to take some responsibility for training people to be good citizens, that they could do so, but they didn't have to do so. So that's one thing, is our peculiar federal structure. The second is an American support for individuality. You should decide on your own path. You should make your own decisions about whom to support as a political candidate, for example, or what profession you should follow, or whom to marry, or things like that. So the assumption was that they didn't need to teach citizens how to be citizens, that citizens would be responsible for learning for themselves. And then the third thing is that this society, the society in the 1780s in the United States, remained a very deferential society. That is to say, the founding fathers assumed that there were that you could distinguish between people who were better and people who were worse. And so they assumed that only better people would be elected. That is to say, wealthier, better educated, more experienced people. And that because of that, they didn't need to be concerned about citizenship, because the people who weren't qualified wouldn't be part of it. The Federalist Papers are a very famous work that the United States has produced about our Constitution. And the assumption in the Federalist Papers is precisely this, that people would, the better people would be elected, that the people would themselves, if they were allowed to govern in a democratic fashion, would govern badly. They would make poor judgments. So they would elect the better people. The better people would meet and would make decisions about what was good public policy. So they could conduct public affairs without the need to educate the people on how to conduct public affairs. And so for these reasons, I think the founding fathers didn't leave us any blueprint for how to be a good citizen. But whether the founding generation really thought about this or knew about this or not, they actually had produced a very a truly outstanding example. And that was Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was born in Boston in 1706. As a young man, he moved from Boston ultimately to Philadelphia. He had been apprenticed as a printer, so the printer's trade was one that he chose to follow when he moved to Pennsylvania. Ultimately, Franklin became famous. We know him for his electricity experiments. We know him for his diplomatic skills. But he also left us a very important document that he called an autobiography. He was one of the first people in the world, really, to write an autobiography. And he left in that autobiography his reflections on how he came to be a responsible citizen and how he decided how to do that. As we know, Benjamin Franklin was an entrepreneur. He was an inventor. He invented the Franklin stove. He was a man of many parts, and above all, he cultivated a certain quality of character. He recognized that self-interest was important. He recognized that it had a value in people's lives. But in many ways, in many ways, his activity throughout his life was all about self-interest, including the things he did to help other people. So his first endeavor, though, what he first figured out was that industry, that his ability to show people that he worked harder and better and smarter than other people, that he was advancing the interests of his clients and patrons through the hard work that he was putting in. And so that was his first endeavor, and this is where he first began to discover qualities, things about human beings that he wanted to focus on. Franklin was also, though, public-spirited, and certainly after he retired from the printing trade, and really from probably the early 1750s on, he was at least semi-retired, and from the 1760s on, he was really fully retired. So he was devoting his time to public service, to the public good, to promoting the public good in many ways. He understood that there were some things that benefited everyone. Paved streets, for example, libraries, fire companies, better street lighting. But he also understood that they in Philadelphia could not wait for government to initiate these improvements, that if they left it up to government, government would never go along with it. So he worked to create these things, libraries, paved streets, street lighting, fire companies, and he did so by getting people together. Sometimes they paid for things. Sometimes, as with the fire company, they simply provided their labor when called upon. And so he worked to organize all of these things for the people of Philadelphia, recognizing that there are common interests that can be served by common enterprise, by working together. So, Franklin had discovered something in all of this that has ensured that American public life is bigger than American political life. And in some ways, American public life is richer than American political life. So as you think about American politics, it's important not just to confine it to the political, the narrowly political, the governmental. We call it civil society. And what we mean by it is that people learn to work together to accomplish common tasks. But they do so independently of the institutions of government. Might be many things: a library, as I've said, fire company, or simply maybe even a book club or a sports club for children, a soccer league or something like that. Football league, I suppose you would say. We do not wait for or really desire to have government organize these activities, these things for us. We recognize that there is a need, and we work together to fill that need without asking for help, without asking for government, or without asking for government's guidance. Franklin recognized that the virtues that he practiced, including this idea of civic participation, this very democratic way of bringing people together to fill a common need. He recognized that this was not traditional, that in fact his notion of virtue, what is a virtuous person, what virtues are important, his ideas of virtue were quite consistent, in fact, with the idea that human beings are basically self-interested beings. And this is one of the things that people find puzzling about Americans. How it is that this notion of self-interest and public interest can go together in the way that they do. And in fact, that you can't really consider these two qualities that Americans have in isolation from each other. Our public spirit and our private interests are, when we talk about citizenship, these are really, these run together. They're separate, but they run together in important ways. Alexis de Tocqueville certainly found this puzzling when he came in the 1830s. Alexis de Tocqueville was a French writer, a French aristocrat, and he came officially to look at the US prison system, but really to look at how it was that democracy worked in America, and how it was, because he thought it was coming to France, he wanted to look at how it was going to work in the French context, or think about how it was going to work in the French context. And I'll talk a little bit more, I'll quote from Tocqueville here in a minute. But before I do that, I want to finish up a little bit on Franklin. Franklin emphasized that character and citizenship are processes. They are not fixed states or fixed conditions. They're things that you need to work at. There are things that you need to work on as you progress through life. What sort of character, what sort of reputation do you want to have? Franklin was very concerned about reputation. He was very concerned about being seen as someone who was able to fix things, who was able to solve problems. He made a list of virtues for himself. But those virtues are not the traditional virtues, right? The traditional virtues, the classical virtues that our culture inherited from Greece and Rome were wisdom, justice, moderation, and courage. Franklin made a list of 13 virtues for himself. But these are the modern virtues. These are the virtues of a shopkeeper. They were temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. And he said, ultimately, he never expected to achieve any of these. He never expected to arrive at some final state of possessing humility, for example, or industry, or sincerity, or justice, or any of the others. But he understood that the journey towards those, that the consciousness of working towards those things, was what made him a better citizen and a better person. So it's the improvement in your character, rather than the idea that you would arrive at some final condition or final state, but the improvement in your character that Franklin thought was the important thing. Later on, Tocqueville said it this way. Tocqueville's term for it was self-interest rightly understood. And he said this: the doctrine of interest rightly understood does not produce great devotions, but every day it suggests small sacrifices. By itself alone, It cannot make a man virtuous, but it forms a multitude of citizens who are orderly, sober, moderate, provident, that is to say foresighted, and in control of themselves. And if it does not lead directly to virtue by means of the will, it approaches it imperceptibly by means of habits. So Tocqueville understood that the ideas that Franklin was putting forward, the idea of working towards citizenship, working towards virtue, was really critical for Americans as they were becoming citizens. And Americans understood this too. Yeah? So even though the Founding Fathers never left us an outline of what a good citizen should be, no instructions about how to use our citizenship, they had in Franklin someone who understood and practiced the art of citizenship, and someone who was able, in his autobiography, to give us an inside look at what that American character might be. So I want to talk a little bit, I've got a few minutes here, I want to talk a little bit about the assumptions of citizenship. I want to talk a little bit about specific activities and responsibilities that citizens might undertake. And I think the important thing, and this goes back a little bit to why we don't try to define who is a good citizen or what a good citizen would do or would be. And that is, we believe that everyone ought to be treated with dignity. We believe that everyone's personhood is important. We believe that everyone is an independent agent and is capable of making her or his own decisions about what is the right thing to do and what is the appropriate thing to do. Certainly with regard to public policy. Are you a Democrat, or are you a Republican, or are you an independent? That's an important question. But that's not something that anyone can answer for you. You have the right to make your choice. You have the right to change your mind once you have decided what you think is important politically, what you think is important in the public realm or in the public sphere. Kant said you should treat everyone as an end in himself, right? That you should treat everyone as if their goals and their relationships with other people are important and autonomous. People are capable of making those judgments. And so they treat other people as if they are able to make those judgments. The second assumption is that, and this is really vital in American politics, the second assumption is that persuasion is better than force. This is at the heart of our governmental institutions. This is the heart of our Constitution. And this is the bedrock assumption of American politics, that we can persuade others to understand our point of view, that we can persuade them that a given course of action is superior to another course of action that maybe we think is not as good an option. So persuasion is really the operative. It's the sauce of American politics. This is what we do, right? We try to persuade each other, and that is the essential quality of American democracy. Beyond that, though, is a belief in civility, that those with whom we disagree have the right to say what they think, that those with whom we disagree should be treated as intelligent, competent adults who can make their own decisions. Civility in the American context assumes that the conversation is more important than the victory of one side or the other. Partly because we understand that victory is always a temporary thing. That victory means we win an argument today, but there's no reason why that argument is going to remain settled. That people can always open up the discussion once again and talk about the issues and reverse their decision, change their minds about things. The great example, of course, in American history is racial segregation. We had segregation for many, many years, but Americans decided that they weren't going to do that anymore. And that decision has remained. So there are also certain specific activities of citizenship that I think we can usefully identify. One is knowledge. If you're going to be a good citizen, you have to have certain qualities of knowledge, or certain knowledges, certain understandings of the way government works, the way the world works, how to put together, say, a soccer team, or how to put together a public library, or how to run a volunteer fire department. All of these things are part of our civic activity, our public activity in America. Yeah? And so the knowledge of these things is built up over time. It's not necessarily knowledge that we receive in school. We learn how to run a volunteer fire company by being a member of a volunteer fire company. We learn how to run a little league or a football league by being part of a football league, by perhaps becoming a coach or an official or something like that. Yeah? And so these pieces of knowledge are acquired over a period of time. There are skills, knowledge and skills. In some ways you can't separate those. The skill of running a football program or a football club depends on having the knowledge of how to run that football club. So there are skill levels, skill sets that people have, that people acquire over time. There's a political scientist, Robert Putnam, who believes that this is a very valuable school for Americans, that Americans, as they learn how to run small towns or small organizations or clubs or library book guilds or something like that, that they are learning civic skills. And this is one of the ways in which Americans learn how to become good citizens. Of course, there are the activities of citizenship. Citizens are responsible for paying taxes. They are responsible for voting. They accept the obligations of citizenship. For many years, the United States had conscription into the military. Many nations do now. Conscription into the military is an important obligation of citizenship that Americans were willing freely to take on. Now, this doesn't mean that there are no conflicts among citizenship or among competing responsibilities. We have a responsibility to act on our self-interest. We assume that people are acting in self-interested ways. But we're also aware that everyone else is also acting on self-interest, and we have to think about how it is that we're going to compensate for that, how it is that we're going to address arguments to them in such a way that their self-interest is engaged. Tensions come from self-interest. Tensions also come from ideology. We are, in this country at the moment, we have quite an ideological difference between the two political parties. Those ideological differences are being ventilated this year and next year as we move into the next election. Whether they will disappear at some point, they probably will, but they'll probably be replaced by other kinds of conflicts and difficulties and so on. Competition demands that we weigh the facts, that we weigh our self-interests, that we weigh our ideology, and that we think about how we are negotiating our responsibilities. There's no right or wrong answer to say if two things compete or if two things are in tension, then always one of them ought to win. You can't make rules about that. You have to weigh that. This is part of the civic project, that you have to understand that a citizen, and Franklin understood this very well, a citizen has to weigh for him or herself what are the critical priorities, and then has to act, and hopefully get others to act in such a way as to make those priorities come true. There are also responsibilities that go with being a public servant. Here in the United States, we have public servants at all levels. We have thousands, tens of thousands of public servants in the United States, from members of school boards in local communities, to members of local councils, to county government, to state government, to the federal government. Hundreds of thousands of people are engaged in government at all of these levels. They have a responsibility to listen to voters. They have a responsibility to know what it is that voters are saying. They have a responsibility to listen to the public and make sure that the public interest is being advanced. They have to make their positions clear. People who are engaged in public policy need to allow people to know what their positions are, how they are going to approach questions of public policy, and be clear about that. And also let them know how and whether they're going to change their minds about things, what might encourage them to change minds about something. And they too have to weigh competing interests. It is always a problem for our representatives in the U.S. Congress in particular, but also in state assemblies and so on, that you are ideologically committed or you are committed in some other way to a particular course of action, and yet it's important to your constituents that something else be done. If you are committed to, let's say, to building a dam, yes, but your constituents believe that that dam would be a bad thing for them, then you have to make a decision. You as a representative have to make a decision how you are going to best serve the interests of your constituents. You might be able to persuade them that the dam is a good thing, and you might not. So, with all of those things, right, assumptions that we make about citizenship, specific activities, ways that we resolve conflicts among citizens, and among civic responsibilities, and then ways that we encourage our elected representatives to behave in responsible ways in government. That's a little picture of American citizenship and responsibility. Like Franklin, we believe in taking responsibility for ourselves. We believe in making sure that everyone has the opportunity to participate in government, but we also believe in making sure that everyone understands that their interests need to be protected, and that they can protect them best by participation in the political process.